In preparation for this event, I had asked my family members, what qualities do you most remember about Dad? And the opinions that were expressed indicated we all had the same thoughts. Dad was a man of industry, a man of generosity, a man of intelligence, a man of integrity, a faithful family man, and most importantly, a man of faith. Most of us in this room would have called Robert Breazeal Dad, or Grandpa, or Great Papa. The legacy that he has left us cannot be fully appreciated unless one knows some family history. In part, Dad's achievements were possible because of the influence of his parents and his grandparents. He embraced what he found to be good or honorable or true, and was intentional about incorporating these philosophies into his life. He in turn took these qualities and passed them to us through the consistent manner in which he lived his life. Our achievements as his children and his grandchildren are very much due to his example and the opportunity we have to stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. And Dad had some pretty big shoulders. I have a granddaughter who's very fond of asking for family stories. Well, today is going to be a day filled with stories. Stories that reflect the values that Dad embodied, and stories that should inspire us to perpetuate these qualities for future generations. Robert Oda Breazeal was born on June 5th, 1932, in a rented farmhouse in the eastern plains of Colorado. He was welcomed by his parents, William, or Bill, and Mabel, and a 2-year-old brother, Jim. The farm was located 2.5 miles outside the tiny town of Wiley, Colorado. Fast forward 5 years, and 2 more little brothers have joined the family, Norman and Tom. To say that Dad and his brothers grew up poor would be an understatement, even for the times. He and his brothers were born during the Great Depression, and they spent their early years living in a primitive farmhouse without the luxury of running water, electricity, or indoor plumbing. Water was drawn from a cistern with a bucket, and bathing was accomplished by pouring heated water into a galvanized tub. The water was heated by a coal stove. Later they got an upgrade, a kerosene stove, and multiple children would use the same bath water. Heat to warm the house was also supplied by that same stove. Most times they used coal, but if coal was in low supply, bushel baskets filled with corn cobs would do. The privy, common to all neighboring farms, was positioned well away from the house. Dad once remarked that in the summer, the outhouse was located 100 yards too close, and in the winter, it was 100 yards too far. Kerosene lanterns were used when lights were needed in the house or in the barn, and they were also convenient when you wanted to warm your hands before milking the cows. Phones were just beginning to become available in larger cities, but of course, in rural Colorado, that was just not available. The one luxury item that the family was able to afford was a battery-powered radio. Several programs aired after school, and he and his brothers looked forward to hearing the latest episodes of The Lone Ranger, Captain Midnight, The Green Hornet, Jack Armstrong and The All-American Boy, and Fibber McGee and Molly. Another source of entertainment was provided by their mother. She read to them each night before bed. Dad recalled hearing stories of Uncle Remus and Briar Rabbit. Brother Tom remembered that over the years, Grandma read them numerous books, and the ones they especially liked, she read twice. Keeping a family of 4 growing boys fed during the 1930s and 1940s was difficult. If they didn't grow it, raise it, or shoot it, they probably didn't have it. Pinto beans with some added ham hock, cornbread, and venison were staples. His mother had a sizable garden, and the family raised cows, pigs, sheep, chicken, and turkeys. Many meals were acquired through hunting. As Dad and his brothers grew older, they hunted deer, rabbit, squirrel, pheasant, duck, geese, and prairie dogs. Now, we hope they didn't eat the prairie dogs. We're hoping they did that just to exterminate the rodents from the fields. A gun was also brought to the fields when working, and anything spotted that was edible was fair game, whether it was in season or not. Dad recalled that as a child, there were several times when his mother announced at dinner time that she just wasn't very hungry today. But Dad did not realize the significance of this until much later. And one year for his birthday, his mother made him an entire water bucket filled with cookies that were just for him. And that was one of his most memorable birthday gifts. On the farm, there was always more to do than could be accomplished in the daylight hours. The boys were up with their dad at the crack of dawn to milk cows, and at times were back in the fields after dinner and working by the light of the full moon. They usually planted fields of hay, alfalfa, and corn, and sometimes wheat was planted as well. As each brother grew old enough, they were trained to operate a tractor in order to lend a hand in the planting and the harvesting. Dad told us stories of how he could drive the little tractor at the age of 6 or 7, but he had to stand up in order to do so. When there were no crops to care for, they were taught how to repair and maintain the farm equipment, and of course there was always the livestock to care for. Dad described his dad as a hardworking man, and his farms were always successful. When Bill was not working on the farm, he was employed by Roosevelt's Public Works Administration, building and maintaining roads. It seemed to Dad that his father was never idle. If there was nothing that needed to be done, his dad would invent something that did.
Dad's understanding of the importance of hard work was learned early in life. He knew from watching his father that any hope of success had to be rooted in diligence and perseverance. Growing up on the farm, Dad accumulated a broad knowledge of skills that enabled him to build anything he wanted or to fix anything that needed it. As we grow up, we watch Dad build, repair, or install a great number of things. If a washing machine, dryer, a dishwasher, or any other appliance broke, Dad repaired it. If the plumbing stopped up, Dad fixed it. If the car needed maintenance or repair, Dad was the mechanic. If a shed or a carport was needed, Dad constructed it. Need a ham radio tower or solar panels installed? No problem. I don't think we ever had to pull solar panels, did he?
Yep. We did grow up in the same house.
Water heater, solar panels.
No problem. Dad ordered it and completed the task. It seemed there was nothing that he could not do or would not do. If there was nothing that needed urgent attention, Dad always had some project going on in the garage. History repeated itself as we watched Dad invent things to do. There were companies that sold kits to electronic enthusiasts, which allowed them to build stereo receivers, test equipment, etc. Dad built our first stereo receiver from one of these kits. He added speakers and a garage turntable and built a beautiful console. The stereo got very heavy use over the years. In the 1960s, color televisions were becoming more affordable. The families in the neighborhood would wait for their old black and white TVs to die before purchasing a new TV. As the black and white sets would wear out, the neighbors would give the old TVs to Dad to strip for parts. He taught me how to remove all the transistors, resistors, diodes, etc. from the circuit boards so they could be reused. He would then separate out all the parts and store them in the corresponding bins. Occasionally, he would get a set which he was able to fix without having to replace the picture tube. As a result, we ended up with 5 black and white TVs before we had our first color television set around 1974. See, Dad wouldn't buy a color TV set, and my grandmother became very, very exasperated and thought that every kid had to be in a house with color TV in order to watch the nature programs. So Grandma bought us our first color TV for Christmas, I believe it was.
I do not remember this.
Because he wasn't about to spend money on a color TV. Dad always enjoyed fabricating things versus having to purchase them. I guess he saw it as a challenge. Grandma Mabel, this is my favorite story. Grandma Mabel had an old vacuum cleaner that she wanted to get rid of. He took the vacuum cleaner and disassembled it, keeping the motor, the wheels, and some of the wiring. At the time, we did not have a gas-powered lawn edger, and this was long before the invention of string trimmers. He mounted the motor on the end of a 2x4 and mounted one of the wheels from the canister on the vacuum cleaner on the opposite side. He fabricated a blade from a piece of steel and fabricated and he fastened that to the shaft. A guard was fabricated from sheet metal. The power leads from the motor were run to the other end of the 2x4, and a momentary switch was installed with a power cord. He had also put on a horizontal handle, so you had the 2x4 like this, and you had the handle, and you had your hand on the button, okay? Gas-powered edgers tended to run at a very low rotational speed. The vacuum cleaner motor, on the other hand, was probably turning at about 3,600 RPM. When fired up, this device made a sound that cannot be adequately described. The motor was probably beyond its rated torque value, and Dad could not have possibly balanced the blade well enough to eliminate vibration problems. He started out edging the backyard, and when he finished, I started walking down the driveway towards the front yard. I saw our neighbor standing at the gate with a wild look on his face, and he blurted out, "What the hell was that?" I explained that Dad had made a lawn edger out of a vacuum cleaner. He had a good laugh and stuck around to watch Dad use it in the front yard. According to legend, whenever someone ever heard a loud, unidentifiable sound, the neighbors would remark, Bob must be building stuff again." Although they didn't say stuff. The edger was absolutely terrifying and can shoot a rock a couple of miles. I think it only lasted about a year or so, and the motor probably overheated or vibrated itself to death. The carport at the Lind Avenue house was built around 1968 to 1970. Dad mounted the horizontal beams with lag bolts on the south side of the house and then set the 4x4 posts on the opposite side of the driveway. I recall the day the beams were mounted. It was a miserable hot day and the air quality was terrible. Dad came to the dinner table looking like he had run a marathon. Once the framework and joists were completed, the 2x4s comprising the roof were laid. I was drafted to help nail them in. Nail guns had not been invented yet, but it was something I enjoyed. Once this step was complete, I was taught how to lay tar paper and shingles. Dad would lay the shingles and I would come in behind and help nail them in. Several years later, when the back shed was built, I vividly recall helping pour the concrete foundation on the floor. For someone my age, I was probably 8 or 9. It was absolutely back-breaking labor. Dad did all the framing and the exterior paneling, but I was able to help lay the roof using the skills we had learned on the carport. When Dad was tired of inventing things to do, he would pull out a Parcheesi board, or more frequently a deck of cards, and we would play games. The first game Dad taught us was Crazy Eights. We were so young we could barely hold the cards. We were probably kindergarten.
Yeah, we're young.
Yeah. Once we mastered Crazy Eights, he taught us more complicated games like hearts, cribbage, pinochle, and crit and pitch. He tried to teach us bridge, but that was a dismal failure. There were too many nuances and things that had to be learned about the bidding process and all that. This is how we learned the cardinal rule of gamesmanship. Never, ever, ever play out of turn. There were many hours of pitch that were played on our visits to Arkansas, and Dad won more than his fair share of them.
It wasn't always work and no play on the farm. There were many fun activities Dad shared with his brothers. Most of the games they invented as young boys involved throwing things at one another. In the winter, they had snowball fights. In the summer, they launched gourds at each other. But don't worry, this was perfectly safe. They had a rule: no headshots. If neither of these items were available, they would go to the barn and tie knots in burlap bags and throw them at each other. The barn had lots of items to hide behind, which was useful when you were launching an attack or defending your base. The most fun part about this game, according to Dad, was that there was no timeouts. If your opponent was forced out of hiding to gather ammunition, it was certain that you could pummel him. In the winter, they went sledding and ice skating. They did not have a pond to skate on, but occasionally an irrigated field would freeze over. So they would pick the best spots, and they were very careful to avoid any clumps of weeds or dirt that would trip them up. In the spring, when the first cut of alfalfa happened, Dad and his brothers would go to the fields because they could catch the baby rabbits that were frightened from their hiding spots by the mower. They built kites and stilts and tire swings. And when they got older, they would scavenge cast-off wheels to build go-karts that they could push. And Dad once built a treehouse, complete with a door in the bottom and a window on one side. When the brothers were older, silly games were replaced by hunting or activities of a more mischievous nature. During the war, Dad and his brothers constructed a dummy from old clothes and a used burlap sack, and they stuffed them with straw. They dubbed their creation Hitler and suspended him from the cottonwoods trees that overhung the road. They suspended it in such a manner that you wouldn't see it until you were right on top of it. The only object here was to see what kind of a reaction that they could get from unsuspecting motorists. And this activity did not disappoint. Drivers would come to a screeching halt and then quickly throw the car in reverse. Then there would be a substantial pause as the poor shocked motorists processed what they were seeing. And then the vehicle would continue on down the road once they figured out they'd been duped. Well, Grandma, knowing that she had 4 boys, about the 3rd or 4th motorist that had slammed on their brakes, she smelled a rat. So she went out to investigate and shut down the game. In high school, Dad and his brothers would go into town to the used car lots. They would feign an interest in purchasing a car just so that they could haggle over the price with the salesman. After they had completely exasperated him, they would change their mind and say, "Oh, I guess we don't want to buy that car after all." Dad did admit that this activity made it much harder to purchase a vehicle when they actually wanted to. In 1941, the United States entered World War II, and the economy began to recover. Dad's parents were able to save enough money to purchase a farm, so in 1942, when Dad was 10 years old, They moved about 30 miles west near the town of Los Animas. As a result of the war, many items were strictly rationed. Gas, tires, shoes, sugar, butter, tobacco, and meat. Tractor factories were converted to manufacturing war materials like munitions, and steel and other metals used in farm machinery were also diverted to the war effort. The labor force also took a huge hit as all the able-bodied young men were drafted into service. These shortages of essential farming implements and available labor placed great stresses on the farming communities that hadn't fully recovered from the Great Depression, and Dad's family was among them. Dad recalled that new tractors were non-existent, even if you had the money to purchase one, and new tires were impossible to obtain. Because of the wartime shortages, the Breazeal family was forced to find creative ways to repair broken equipment, and they continued to rely on teams of horses to pull the hay wagons. When the soles of their shoes wore through, they stuffed them with cardboard. Other changes also began to occur in Colorado. Between 1943 and 1946, 48 POW camps were established to hold German and Italian prisoners of war. There were 3 large bases in Colorado. Each of these 3 base camps had smaller branch camps associated with them, and one of these branch camps was located in Los Animas. Farmers in need of laborers could contract their local branch camp and request a crew of prisoners to assist them. These work crews became an invaluable resource to the agricultural community, and the program was deemed a success to both the local farmers and the government. Dad's family used this program often enough to become familiar with the different crews, and there was one particular crew that they were especially fond of. So they always made an effort to request that crew whenever they called. Early on, it became clear that the meager lunch the men were sent with was not sufficient for the work that was expected of them. So Mabel made sure that there was always a big pot of pinto beans available in the field for them, and Dad's father, who was a smoker himself, knew that the men would appreciate cigarettes. So he would take a pack of cigarettes to the field with him and give it to the foreman of the work crew. The foreman would then divide the cigarettes evenly among them, even if that meant splitting the last cigarette into fourths with an axe. One day after this work crew had finished and was already heading back to camp, a storm appeared on the horizon. Even the children knew that this storm that was coming, and it was coming with a fury, was going to destroy every stalk of corn left standing in the field. Any potential loss of a crop was taken very seriously, as it could mean the difference between going hungry or not. Bill had a call sent to the camp with a request to send the work crew back as soon as possible. When the crew returned, the foreman instantly understood the urgency of the situation. First, he counted off the rows of remaining corn, and then he divided the rows evenly among the crew. He made sure that each man knew he was being held personally responsible for the portion assigned to him. With a lump in his throat and tears in his eyes, Dad related that those tired young men rose to the occasion. They busted a hump to try and save that crop for his family, and they did. When I first heard about the PO work crews as a kid, I couldn't wrap my head around the fact how Grandma and Grandpa could so easily give up their depleted resources to the enemy. When I questioned Dad about this, he said, "No, they weren't the enemy. They were just young men who wanted to go home. They had no more use for Hitler's war than we did." I can't think of a story that illustrates how well Dad was taught what true compassion and generosity looks like.
From the example set by his parents, we shouldn't be surprised that Dad grew up to be a man of great generosity. Dad was always delighted to hear about the successes of his children and grandchildren. He knew that through his lifetime, God had blessed him financially and wanted to be a blessing to his family as they worked to establish themselves. One granddaughter articulated it best when she said, "Grandpa was incredibly giving when it came to the things he believed and would bring value and well-being to our life." She was Dad's first grandchild to go away to a 4-year anniversary and university. He recalled how Grandpa responded when he heard that she had taken on a job to cover her living expenses. He made it a point of sending money and encouraging notes for pursuing my degree. He didn't want me to work too much and lose focus on my schooling, and he didn't want my parents to take out loans. I will never forget his generosity. Dad was known to invest in the lives of his grandchildren by supporting such things as mission trips, study abroad programs, and gifts for college funds. He took great pleasure in contributing to big life events like the purchase of a first home. Several grandchildren commented that when Grandpa became aware that they were gathering money for a down payment, he would call them up and let them know that he wanted to contribute. These offers were always unexpected because Grandpa never tooted his own horn, but they are always deeply appreciated and are remembered to this day. Another granddaughter noted that Grandpa wasn't just generous with his money, but also with his time and his, I think it's supposed to be belongings. She says, his pool table was always open for the grandkids to use, and I will never attribute. And it will forever attribute the smell of the I think that's something auto-corrected, I think. Yeah, I think it's an auto-correct. I think it's supposed to say, I will forever associate the smell of a powder that you could add to your hands to playing pool in the basement. He trusted us with riding his lawnmower and let us ride around the yard. He hooked up the tractor and trailer and took us on tractor rides. He spent countless hours playing cards with us, and anytime he asked, "Want to go for a walk?" he'd say, "Yep, sounds good," and would put on his hat or flannel shirt and go out on a walk with us. Want to shoot guns? Grandpa would go out. Grandpa would get them all out and set them on the ladder and to use as support and teach us how to shoot. The older grandchildren remember walking to the reservoir with Grandpa in Arcadia and looking for golf balls. They also mentioned being taken for rides on his motorcycle. He had a little tiny, like a Honda 90? Little bitty Honda motorcycle. Almost like a moped. He began his high school years at Bent County High School, and it was quite the culture shock to be one of the 110 classmates in the freshman class. Dad didn't really like Bent High School. He felt that most of the other kids, who were city kids, looked down on the farm kids. Bent High School did have a Future Farmers of America club, and he became a member along with his brother Jim and his cousin Morse. The school also had a vocational agriculture course, which was offered to the farm boys who intended to make farming their vocation. The course was structured so that half of the time was spent in the AG shop, where they were given the opportunity to practice welding, soldering, farm carpentry, and auto mechanics. This was Dad's favorite class. In 1947, Bill was convinced to move near Ottawa, Kansas to try dry farming. With this method of farming, irrigation or canals or sprinkler systems were not used. Historically, this area of Kansas had proven that the amount of rainfall necessary to ensure a successful harvest was in adequate supply. This relieved the farmer of the labor-intensive practices of irrigating the fields and more effort could be invested in planting, thus creating a higher yield of produce and increased profits. When the rain came as expected, this was great. But being completely dependent on the fickleness of the weather proved that the hypothetical did not always match with reality. Unfortunately, the family moved to Kansas just in time to experience a drought year. It should be noted that at this point, we weren't completely out of the Dust Bowl either, so you still had bouts of dust storms and drought. Some of the benefits of the move to Kansas were a farmhouse that had electricity in it and a phone. The phone was a party line that was shared by 3 neighbors. It had a hand crank that you would turn to connect with the operator, and she would connect you with the number that you wanted. Another advantage to the move for Dad was that once more he was attending a very tiny high school, Appanoose Rural High School. And I looked this up, and there's actually a picture of the schoolhouse. It's actually not even a city, it's like a township.
Yeah, it's
It's a white spot on the road.
yeah.
Dad felt much more at home there. He didn't feel that rift between the city kids and the farm kids. And the entire student body hovered right around 50 students. The faculty was 4 members strong, one of which also served as the principal. The move, however, did create a hiccup for Dad's academics. Relocating in the middle of the school year resulted in changes in curriculum. This proved to be an insurmountable hurdle when it came to his algebra class. He swears that the school agreed to give him a pity D instead of an F, only because he convinced them he had no intention of attending college. This allowed him to graduate. Dad wasn't lying. He truly had no intention of pursuing higher education. He was much like his father in this respect. He found satisfaction in coaxing seeds into a mature harvest and was content with the daily activities of farm life. His plans included nothing more than to complete his compulsory school attendance and then farm. One drought year in Kansas was enough to send the Breazeal family in search of greener, irrigated pastures. They chose to return to Wiley, Colorado. Dad had no desire to switch to yet another high school in his senior year, so arrangements were made for him to stay with a classmate's family in Centropolis. For the first time, Dad was living at an address that wasn't a farm and wasn't outside the city limits sign. Dad graduated from Appanoose High School in 1950 with the 12 other seniors and immediately returned to farming with his dad. He was perfectly and utterly content with the beginning of his long life career as a quiet, unassuming farmer, and then God laughed.
Okay, now for this next part, I want you all to know that the honor garden ceremony was for me, not for Dad. When Dad made his funeral arrangements, this was not part of it, and I thought it should be. And after reading this, you'll know why he didn't feel like it needed to be a part. In 1952, during the Korean War, Uncle Sam sent a letter to Rural Route Number 1, Wiley, Colorado, and invited Dad to join the United States Army. He was inducted in November 1952 and sent to Camp Roberts in San Luis Obispo, California. Here he developed a permanent and deep-seated hatred for standing in lines. When basic training had been completed, a stress fracture in Dad's foot probably kept him from being sent overseas. But Dad said everybody was done shooting each other by the time he was out of basic training, so the odds of him being sent to Korea were probably slim to start with. So instead of being shipped to Korea, he was flown to Fort Lewis, which is located in the state of Washington. Compliments to the U.S. Army, Dad had his first experiences traveling by train and airplane. At Fort Lewis, he worked as a clerk in the Special Orders Building. Now, to a farm boy accustomed to manual labor and God's great outdoors, plucking away at a typewriter in a little office was the 10th circle of Dante's Inferno. It was here that Dad learned to despise inefficiency and the Army's arbitrary promotion system. Before his arrival at Camp Lewis, the Special Orders Office was operated by 2 sergeants. When the first sergeant retired, Dad replaced him. Somewhere down the line, Dad was promoted to corporal and the second sergeant retired. Dad was so competent that he had no problem staffing the 2-position office single-handedly. The second sergeant was never replaced, but Dad was never recognized for another promotion. It was at this point that Dad realized that the Army didn't operate on a merit-based system, and this was not the environment where he could be all that he could be. Meanwhile, back in Colorado, Dad's little brother Norman had graduated from high school, and his youngest brother Tom was just about to enter. Dad's mother, eager for her boys to have better and more educational opportunities, persuaded her husband to give up farming and move to Pasadena, California. Now, this is when Dad would say, when I joined the Army, I gave up on farming. I think what he really meant was it was grabbed from my hands without my permission. So one day, Dad discovered that the Army had an early separation for education program. The program stipulated that if an active duty serviceman was accepted into an accredited college, he could obtain an early release up to 90 days prior to the beginning of his first semester. Dad lost no time in applying to Pasadena City College. And the second he had his acceptance letter in hand, he was filing out his paperwork in triplicate for an early release. Dad was discharged from active duty on November 24th, 1952, and ironically, the field of study that Dad chose to pursue was electronics, a discipline in the Department of Mathematics. Dad graduated from PCC with an Associate of Arts degree in electronics and then transferred to California Polytechnic University of San Luis Obispo. Here with his roommate, Wilson Morgan, Here he met 2 people which would have a lasting impact on his life. The first was his roommate, Wilson Morgan. Wilson and Dad became lifelong friends, and it was Wills who introduced Dad to the hobby of amateur radio. Both earned their amateur radio licenses while at Cal Poly and were active for many years. The second was a dorm mate by the name of Jerry Tucker. Dad's charitable description of Jerry was, he was a nice fellow, but he was a rather odd duck. Now, Jerry had a cousin named Helen Hancock. Helen's description of her cousin was, oh, he was just a weirdo. Jerry kept bugging his buddy Bob to go on a blind date with his cousin Helen. At the same time, he kept trying to convince his cousin Helen to go on a blind date with his college buddy Bob. Helen had no desire to be set up with one of Jerry's weirdo friends, and Dad had no desire to meet a female version of Jerry. They both attempted to politely decline Jerry's repeated offers until Jerry's relentless tactics finally made them both succumb. They both figured that if they went on just one date, and they were sure it was going to be just one date, that Jerry would finally leave them alone. So the date was arranged, but by the time the evening ended, both parties were both shocked and pleasantly surprised. Dad was shocked by the fact that Jerry and Helen shared the same gene pool but were remarkably different. And Helen was shocked that Jerry actually had a normal friend. Cupid's arrows found their mark that night, and this was the beginning of Mom and Dad's relationship that resulted in a marriage that lasted 47 years. Dad graduated with his bachelor's degree in mathematics in the beginning of December 1958, and he and Mom were married on December 28th of the same year. Following the wedding, they packed up all of their possessions into Dad's 1950 Plymouth and moved into a rented house on First Avenue in Arcadia. A year later, they purchased their first home at 4157 Lind Avenue, where they lived until he retired. A son, Robert, joined them in 1959, and I came along in 1961. Even though Dad's parents had strong moral values, they did not profess any type of faith when Dad was a child. They didn't attend church, and Christmas and Easter holidays were not observed with any kind of religious importance attached to them. However, Dad's paternal grandmother, Grandma Cooper, was a woman of strong faith, and she earnestly desired to see her children and grandchildren come to know and love the Lord. When Grandma Cooper lived near them in Colorado, she would take the boys to Sunday school with her. She prayed for them faithfully, and she let them know she was praying for them. When moves separated them from their grandmother, church attendance stopped, but the seeds that had been planted by Grandma Cooper remained. When we were very little, Mom and Dad would drop us off at the nearest church, but they didn't attend themselves. After about a year of this, Dad realized that he wasn't setting a good example. So that's when he decided that family worship should become a priority. And this is when we started to go to a little church called Arcadia Friends. One Sunday at the end of the service, the pastor extended an invitation to anyone who would like to pray with him to begin their own personal relationship with Christ. Dad grabbed Mom's hand and said, "We've got to do this." As Dad was leading Mom out of the pew, she instructed Bob and I to sit tight until they came back. Of course, we were too little to fully understand the significance of what was happening, but we knew it must be important because when Mom and Dad returned, Mom had tears in her eyes. Dad always said that his conversion was the direct result of his grandmother Cooper's years of faithful prayers. And it didn't take Dad long before he found ways to put his faith into action. He started a Sunday evening study for the junior high group. The students were divided into teams and competed against one another to answer questions or recite verses. I remember that the students enjoyed the competitiveness of the program. Bob and I were very small.
Yeah.
A couple of years later, when the children's church director left, Dad found a Jet Cadets program and began working with the 4th through 6th grade students to fill that void. Tina and I were part of those Jet Cadets.
That's right. That's right.
He became an usher. He was on several church boards. And if I remember correctly, some included the education committee and the finance committee. When the VBS director wanted props, she knew Dad was the person to approach. I remember Dad once constructed an entire elaborate Small World facade. He led adult Bible studies, which were hosted at our home. If there was a church work day, he was there from start to finish. And of course, we were there to help too. After Mom and Dad moved to Arkansas, he was an usher, and he was also part of a mowing crew for years. When the church built a free clinic from the ground up, Dad was there hanging drywall or doing whatever else was planned for the day. He became a member of the Gideon Society, and after Mom passed, he would volunteer to sit with those who were hospitalized. He was also a faithful steward with his tithe and supported both local and global ministries. Dad loved the Lord deeply, and even after the dementia had taken hold, he still encouraged his grandchildren to trust in the goodness of God's character, saying, "God might let you get dragged into the mud, but he will be there to drag you all the way through it." When the progression of the dementia worsened, and his memory was more things forgotten than things remembered, he still never forgot that God loved him. There wasn't a single dinner time grace where Dad didn't express his appreciation for God's overwhelming love and ask for his continued guidance and protection.
Dad landed a job with the Hycon Manufacturing Company in Monrovia right out of college. When he was a young engineer, the first thing that he did was go to the production floor and start asking questions. He wanted to know what things worked well and what things did not. He asked questions about his component and what would be expected to and what would be expected to interact with all of the other pieces of equipment. In this manner, he quickly distinguished himself by his work ethic and his ability to address specific design problems and create effective and practical solutions. Dad got the opportunity to work on some interesting projects like the Hicon Model B panoramic camera that was used in the U-2 spy plane to gather intelligence during the Cold War. Hicon was later bought by Actron Industries, and Actron Industries worked very closely with McDonnell Douglas. And the company was eventually purchased by McDonnell Douglas. During this project, Dad was the project engineer responsible for the design of the avionics status panel for the F-15 Eagle. He also left his fingerprints on projects for the DC-9, DC-10, the L-1011, the F-14, F-16, and the F-18 Hornet. Also the Gemini and Mercury space programs, as well as the mast-mounted sight used on the Apache and the Kiowa helicopters. In fact, his little group was in charge of all of the design and production of that component. That's the component that allows you to be in the helicopter, come up over the very top of a hill, see the target, fire at the target, destroy the tank, and come right back down again. So the only thing the enemy ever saw was this much of the rotor. That was first used, I believe, in the Gulf War, first Gulf War. So Dad worked hard, and we knew he required the same level of professionalism from the teams that he led. He often called production meetings come to Jesus meetings. Because at these events, every failure, every mistake or missed deadline was going to be exposed, and someone was going to have to atone for it. It didn't happen frequently, but there were also a few instances when Dad would come home and vocalize his disgust over some new hire that had ignored the design specs or put the project behind schedule. The health of McDonnell Douglas was tied to their ability to obtain government contracts from the Defense Department. Changes in the political climate led to extreme swings in the amount of government contracts that were available. This resulted in waves of layoffs and reorganizations during the lean years. This would be right after, this would be post-Vietnam War. This would be 1975 to about 1980. There was never a guarantee that you still had employment when your project had been completed. But each time Dad's team completed a project, he found himself assigned to the team of the next hot item. By the time he retired in 1994, he had attained the position of senior project engineer and had been employed by 4 different companies just from working diligently every day at the same desk. Dad attributed his good fortune solely to God's providential hand in his life, but those of us who knew Dad well know that God probably didn't need to intervene much for this to happen. Even though Dad slipped into college through the back door, he had a deep appreciation for his education and the opportunities it afforded him. He began to save for our college educations before we entered kindergarten. Because we lived in the county, our school district was in the El Monte School District, and the high school did not have a good reputation. Dad remembered that he felt inadequately prepared for college and was not going to let history repeat itself. Mom and Dad made the decision to send us to private high school, even though it was a huge financial investment. I remember that when I started college, The yearly tuition was less than the tuition of the private high school. Dad wanted to see his grandchildren obtain college degrees also. He contributed to their dreams financially and was always eager to hear how everything was progressing in their fields of study. Because of Dad's involvement, his children and his grandchildren have accumulated 6 associate degrees, 4 bachelor's degrees, 2 master's degrees, 2 postgraduate teaching credentials, and 1 POST degree, whatever that is.
Police officer.
Oh, okay. During the years spent in Arcadia,
That doesn't matter, he's the middle kid.
during the years spent in Arcadia, Dad invested in a piece of rental property. His plan was to ensure that Mom was financially secure after his passing. It didn't take long for Mom and Dad to become personally invested in the lives of their tenants. One such couple, Chang and Mei Ling from Taiwan, had no family here in the States. Whenever they had questions about American customs or needed advice, they came to Mom and Dad. It wasn't long before the Changs were a part of our family. When Matthew, Elaine, and Lisa were born, it was only natural that Mom and Dad became Grandma and Grandpa to them. There were many holidays where we all celebrated together. We enjoyed learning about Chinese New Year and how to make egg rolls and fried rice. We introduced them to Christmas and Easter traditions. Before Dad retired, he knew he wanted to leave California. Although he had enjoyed his job at McDonnell Douglas, he had always hated that it was in the middle of LA. He didn't like the traffic or the smog, or the fact that his neighbors were right under his elbows. He couldn't wait to find a piece of land where he couldn't see or hear his closest neighbors. He was considering several different locations when he happened to hear from his college buddy, Wills Morgan. Wills had been all over the United States, and he had suggested that Mom and Dad check out the Ozarks. Mom and Dad took his suggestion and planned a trip to look. When they hit Mountain Home, they fell in love. They came back and announced they had purchased 40 acres of land outside the city limits, and that they had intended to put a house right smack dab in the middle of it. The directions to the property included the phrase, when you turn off the paved highway. And Dad could not have been happier.
Yeah.
Actually, they took 4 trips. They made sure they saw it in each season before they were willing to put their name on the dotted line.
Dad hired a contractor, and together they designed a beautiful home set among the hardwood trees with a creek running behind it. There was not a neighbor in sight. The home was specifically designed to include rooms for both Mom and Dad's mothers. Dad's mom elected not to move with them, but Verla did. The house was finished in 1996, and the 3 moved into it the spring of that year. Dad spent the next several years landscaping and clearing trees. He dug out a pond and he built a deer blind. Then he planted a huge garden, and when he did, the wildlife quivered with anticipation. He then constructed a tall fence which could be electrified. He built a workshop, extended the deck at the back of the house. He built a playhouse for the grandkids. And when the garden failed to produce as it was expected, his research indicated that a lack of pollinators was the problem. So he established an apiary. He built decorative windmills and wells and gazebos. Mom thought chickens would be a great idea, so he indulged her. And he built a hen house with a covered chicken run. When any tree had the audacity to fall down, he was out there cutting it up and splitting it into firewood. He invented all sorts of projects that kept him outside all day. He even began to repair the neglected county road that led to his property. And for the next 10 years, Dad could not have been happier. In April 2005, Mom was diagnosed with terminal brain tumor, and by January of 2006, she had passed. And this was the only thing I can remember that Dad couldn't fix. Later, health issues demanded that a move into town was prudent. So in 2017, Dad moved into the city. He immediately put in a garden and planted some blackberries. He lived there until moving back to California with us in 2022. For the next 2 years, we watched as the dementia progressed and slowly took our beloved Dad and Grandpa and Great Papa away. He was finally escorted into the presence of Jesus on January 21st, 2025. He is now whole in mind and body and spirit. And Dad couldn't be happier.